Well, good morning, everyone. My talk's not quite as technical, or possibly even interesting for that matter, as the previous two. But the subject of my talk today is on a period of pre-Isan deformation in the Mary Kathleen domain. And I just wanted to share some basic ideas on what might be the influence of that event on burstal suite chemistry and the Isan structures. And I wanted to thank the GSQ for their funding and support as well. The main point of this talk is simply to suggest that the effects of this event might be another variable worth considering in the search of copper, gold, and uranium and rare earth elements. At this point, it's not entirely clear to me whether this event is localized only within some of these areas, which I'll show examples from today, and elsewhere, basically the Isan orogeny is modifying them to such an extent that any effect that they've had on the architecture, for example, is basically rendered insignificant, or whether it's basically widespread, it's overprinted by the Isan orogeny over much of these areas, but it's only within these lower strain domains, which again I'm showing examples from today, where you're really able to separate the events because of the comparatively weaker overprinting effects of the Isan orogeny, or simply how strain is partitioned in these areas, which allows you to kind of pull them apart and then it'll constrain them a bit more easily. So I thought I'd start with my conclusions first, just to put the rest of my talk in a bit more context. This is the wordiest slide, the rest is just pictures mainly. The first point is that the 1750 to 1710 million year deformation has been documented in several localities now. And the ones I'll show are just the areas I've worked in. And in these areas, as I said, there's both good timing constraints and it's comparatively easier to pull apart the effects of the Isan from these earlier events. And the point below that is basically what I just mentioned before. The burstal suite plutons are moderately prospective. There's a few mines that you can point, operating in pre-older mines that you can point towards some of these plutons. But their prospectivity and spatial relationships may be partly influenced by their timing of emplacement, that is pre-Syn or post, relative to this deformation and metamorphism during this time. And I was in particular pondering what the effects of metamorphic fluids might be on them. The third point is that in these areas where I've been working in, the 1750 to 1710 structures do not appear to be particularly prospective, but they will have an influence on the localization of strain and associated or subsequent fluid flow pathways. And in this case, I was thinking specifically about, veining and such. And the fourth point is that the more detailed studies of metamorphism are currently underway. And ideally, a fairly detailed paragenesis series coupled with some ages would be ideal. But I think the dating will prove to be quite challenging. So going forward, my talk's just split into two parts. The first is just going to present evidence of this event and the different timing of some of these plutons. And the second part is just sharing some basic ideas on what their influence might be on the burstal suite and Isan structures. So I'll show examples from these three areas here, the Mount Godkin area, the kind of Mary Kathleen area, and this part of the Duchess belt. In these areas, the rocks of interest are taking place in the rocks of the Leichhardt superbasin, more specifically mainly variations of the Corella formation. There's two relevant periods of magmatism. The first is the Wonga suite, which shows crystallization ages between 1780 and 1740 million years. And there are these kind of darker red color ones down here. And then the burstal suite, which is contemporaneous to slightly younger. and which are these red ones, and they tend to outcrop to the east of the Wonga Suite. There's two main broad periods of deformation, which can be subdivided into individual events. And this is this older period here, and then the Isan orogeny. In the Mary Kathleen syncline, perhaps the best evidence is this undeformed dolerite dike, which intrudes east-northeast across the syncline fold axis. And that shows an age of about 1737 million years. At smaller scales, we have these folded xenoliths within the burstal granite, and these are interpreted as the country rock being folded before being incorporated into the granite itself. And the granite in these areas, at least, are undeformed, so it's not simply a consequences of that xenolith and the granite being folded simultaneously. Oh yeah, and the granite's about 1740. In the Mount Godkin area, most of the Mount Godkin granite intrudes between these two faults here, the West and East Godkin fault. The timing of the West Godkin fault appears to predate the granite itself by some unknown period of time, based on it simply not cutting through this part of the granite on the northwestern side. Within the area, there are two generations of fold recognized, and they're both interpreted to predate the granite, which is largely undeformed except towards the margins of the granite itself. And it's not well documented on this map, but towards the margins, you do develop a foliation. And the age of this granite, I had two ages similar to this from these two locations at about 1708, which arguably makes it one of the younger of the burstal suite plutons. I'll show examples from these two areas of the Duchess belt. The first one is this Myubee area, which contains three main intrusions here, all in place at different times. The oldest of which is this Myubee gabbro, which contains a foliation and lineation assigned a D1b timing. And then we have the intrusion of the Myubee granite, and this is just a different phase of it. And that's interpreted as Syn D2, based on it appearing to intrude within the hinge of this antiform here. And then we have, and it also bearing this foliation and lineation assigned a D2 timing. We then have this, what appears mostly to be an undeformed syenite, which is actually of intermediate composition, about 61% silica, and that's interpreted as postdating D2. And here are just some examples of the nature of some of these contacts. But the age of the Myubee granite is about 1720. From this part here, we have the northernmost part of the Revenue granite and the southernmost part of the Overlander granite. The Revenue granite is interpreted to predate both of these D1b and D2 events in the area. But by contrast, the Overlander granite, it shows a foliation and lineation around the margins, but in the core it appears mostly undeformed. I think I have a photo. It looks kind of like that. And it also doesn't appear to be folded by this, this D2 syncline here. So it's currently interpreted as a late D2 timing of emplacement. And the age of that granite was dated at 1741 here. But I do believe there's another age further north in it, somewhere between about 1730 and 1740. In the southern part, the only thing I wanted to point out is that this is mainly an S1B foliation, and the shear zone down here is later, but just how much later was not easy to constrain. And so it's potentially an Isan structure, and it's a multiple core, it's not an anastomosan, and it had a mostly sinistral shear sense, but I didn't see any mineralization associated with it, but then again, I didn't look much further south than that either. So this is the general timeline of events as far as I can tell. Probably in reality, there's more events taking place at both of these times. But one of the points I just wanted to postulate, I suppose, was whether there is some variations in the chemistry of some of these plutons based on them being more or less affected by any of this deformation or metamorphism during this period. And so that's basically my point here. The chemistry on the right is from the Myubee intrusions, which are potentially a useful way to test whether their chemistry is being influenced based on their differences in timing. But unfortunately, their variations in the petrogenetic history introduces so many variables, so it's difficult to specifically say any specific changes in chemistry can be directly linked with whether they have or have not been affected by metamorphic fluids, for example. And so I think ideally that maybe I try to do something like compare burstal plutons, which are of similar composition and petrogenetic history, but differ only in their age relative to their vent, to try to see any differences there. Here's a plot of these things with just some of the more economically interested elements. And I don't know about you, but I didn't find any particularly striking patterns there. And yeah, so nothing particularly useful with those intrusions, which is the only data that I personally collected. So the significance with respect to Isan structures is that fluid flow will be strongly influenced by the pre-existing fractures and foliations, even shear zones faults, and that's particularly true within the upper crust, of course. And the relationship between fracture formation and vein emplacement are closely interrelated, so it's potentially an important thing to keep in mind. Another thing is that there appears to be a lot of geometric similarity between the orientations of some of these pre-Isan structures and those that formed during the Isan orogeny, and indeed during the Barramundi orogeny for that matter. I'm not specifically discussing the orientations of the stress fields, but just the geometries would seem to favor, at least in some of these cases, the reactivation of these older structures during the Isan orogeny at a fairly low energy cost. And related to this point is that some of these shear zones may be longer lived than is suspected. Here's an example of the Mary Kathleen shear zone. I forgot to put on the location of the mines around here. The Mary Kathleen mine is, I think, around about here, and the Lane Dorothy's down here somewhere in Mount Cullen. But they have mineralization ages at about 1550 and 1530. So they're certainly active during the Isan orogeny, but there's nothing really to constrain the maximum age except for the country rock. So potentially they could form a lot earlier than is suspected. And in this case, I'm not saying that this Mary Kathleen shear zone is older, but it's in some of these cases there's really nothing to constrain the maximum age, and so it's an interesting thing to ponder. So thank you. That's all.
Thanks, Josh. Any questions? Yes, ma'am. Derek's coming with a microphone.
Does it work now? I actually have a lot of questions, but I'll
sure.
just ask a few. What do you mean specifically by less or more perspective? In terms of, you said the granites may be perspective, but the structures aren't. And the reason I ask is I would have thought that if these are hydrous granites exsolving fluids, then the perspectivity would be in the veins associated with their emplacement rather than within the intrusion itself. So could you clarify that a bit?
Yeah, I suppose because particularly around the Mary Kathleen area, it's a bit of a mystery just what role the magmas have in influencing the concentrations of those particular mines. I suppose I was just wondering whether I guess it depends on what assumptions or what interpretations you make about the direct roles between the magmas themselves and the subsequent mineral occurrences and concentrations. When I was discussing it there, I was mainly thinking about maybe the role of leaching during by metamorphic fluids and concentrating them, and potentially it's not that much, but perhaps you have a pre-concentration during this older event, and then you have the Isan orogeny, and then it's another event which additionally concentrates more or something like that. It's not specifically a topic that I focus much in my work, but it seems like maybe there was something to think about there. So that was my main idea.
And is it possible to just speculate a bit on the origin of these granites? Are these arc related? Are they just deep melting in the crust, or
that's a tricky one. I did have I guess so far I've been leaning more towards a kind of arc setting, but I will concede it's very ambiguous, and every time I think I've convinced myself of one way or the other, I kind of go flip-flop. But I guess there is a paper that was accepted recently that does go into a bit more detail about a possible how an arc setting would work, but yeah, it's difficult to say because there is so many little points that you could argue against. I mean, if you say is an arc, why isn't there any, melange or, these traditionally arc-like characteristics? So, yeah, I'm afraid I don't have much more to say on that point. Yeah.
That's great.